Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, Isis, Imitation of Life. The Goddess Next Door helps a young black girl overcome racism during the era of Jim Crow in this Golden Age Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Imitation of Life in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. Recently, I got an offer I had to refuse. Now, as everyone who has watched this channel and has read my blog knows, I have always wanted to write comic books. And an individual came to me on Facebook in a message asking me to write his comic book. And I really wanted to write this comic book. However, after I read the first issue of this comic, my enthusiasm started to wane as related to this project. When I looked at this first issue, there were numerous issues with the structure of the story. There was absolutely no character development, and there were serious issues as related to the pacing, and there was no real serious conflict or any sort of depth given to any of the characters that would make them appear to be relatable to readers. So when I took a critical look at the comic, I saw numerous issues with the story that's related to the concept and the premise. And when I looked at those issues, I really saw a project that there wasn't much I could really do anything with. And those issues were exacerbated by this creator who wanted to try to press me on my response to him. He really wanted me to give him an answer almost quickly. And when you have people who want to give you an answer quickly in the publishing world, that's a red flag, because in the publishing world, things oftentimes go very slow. And the reason why they go very slow is because a writer has to take time to figure out if this project is right for them, where they can fit in this project, and what they can contribute to the project to make it the best project it can possibly be. Because when you are writing a story, you want that story to meet certain standards, and you want to produce a story that is of the highest quality, because the story that you're producing is your calling card, and it's that story that is going to get you work from other publishers and get you opportunities to have your work seen by other publishers. And after I dealt with this individual, I saw that they really did not understand things about professionalism in the publishing industry, because as someone who has been in trade publishing for over 15 years, I understand that there's a protocol to things. And when you have an individual who wants to really rush you, that's a red flag, because it's someone who is not really understanding that while you are enthusiastic about your project, a professional has to objectively assess your project, one, and two, they have to assess what their place will be in this project. Now, this individual came to me talking about his time at Marvel Comics and how when you have an opportunity like this at an entry level, you have to take it. But in the trade publishing world, opportunities are not seen that way. Usually, again, editors and publishers and writers are looking at opportunities from the perspective of how this is going to benefit them. Now, in the comic book world, they make it look like it's a unilateral thing and they are giving you this great opportunity. But in the trade publishing world, the writers look at things very differently. They don't see it as a so-called foot in the door, because they understand that if you enter the door with a poor quality product, you're going to be sent right back out the door. Because, and again, in trade publishing, 90% of all books fail, and if you have a book that does poorly, you are not going to be asked to come back. So you might get the foot in the door, but then somebody might kick you out because the product is bad, the product is getting bad reviews, and as a mid-list author, you haven't proven things that your book is quality, it's getting good reviews, or is capable of getting sales. So when I looked at this guy's attitude, it just wasn't the right attitude from a professional publisher's perspective or a professional writer's perspective. Because, again, in the trade publishing world, things run slowly, things are running slowly because everybody has to be patient, because when you are putting together a book, it's a lot of risk. And when the writer looks at a book, again, he has to look at it not only as related to where he can fit into the story, but how he can make a impact as related to sales. He has to have a plan for what type of stories he wants to tell and how those stories will appeal to a larger audience. So he was telling me things about how in the comic book industry, people assign you a project, and that doesn't, again, really work, because if you look at the comic book industry, if people are getting assigned books, then we're looking at these people, they don't really have much passion on the page, there's not much direction, and it's hard for the writer to actually get into the character these days because they are being told what to write, and the attitude that they have about writers is an absolutely wrong one, because they're sitting there telling me that, oh, writers can write anything, and this is what he told me, writers can write anything, but what he doesn't understand is that writers have to have a passion for what they're writing, they have to have knowledge about what they're writing, because one of the rules of writing is that you write what you know, and most importantly, you have to have a plan for what you want to write. So you just can't come into a D or C list character with no vision for that character. And this is something that I would have an issue with if this is the standard for the comic book industry, because again, in trade publishing, they just don't bring writers in unless those writers have a plan on how to go out here and craft great stories, and a craft to go out here and market those stories afterward. Because when you are a publisher, you are putting money on the table for these books, and you want to get a return on your investment. And when I listened to this individual talking to me in messages, it showed his inexperience as related to the publishing industry. Moreover, it showed that he really didn't understand how the business side of it worked, because he contacted me talking about he wanted me to write his comic and give me this opportunity. But when I asked some critical questions, it showed that he really was more emotional about things and emotional about his character than he was about making sure that this is the best story it can possibly be. And one of the things that I found to be really questionable, another red flag, was this individual had never read any of my fantasy titles to see if my approach to storytelling would be a good fit. Because whenever I go out here and I hire an artist like a Bill Walko or a Mike Williams or a Drew Swift, the first thing I do is I take a look at their portfolio, and then after I take a look at their portfolio of work, then I go out here and I make first contact with these individuals. So if I want to work with an artist, I always look at their work to see if this is a good fit for my characters and if this is a good fit for the story I want to tell. Because if I hire the wrong artist and they design a cover, then it's not going to be visually appealing to my readers. And this is something that any independent publisher has to really think about. Whether they're hiring a writer or an artist, they have to think about whether or not this individual's approach to whatever it is, art or storytelling, is a good fit for their characters, because you are investing money in this individual, and the money you invest has to pay off. So when I listen to this guy and he tells me he wants me to write for him, but he has never read any of my samples, that was a red flag for me, because the only book he had read was a nonfiction book. But if you want me to write in your fantasy genre, you must read my writing samples. That's something that is essential to any sort of business agreement, is that we have to be on the same page, and you have to know what you're getting from me as a writer. If you're going to hire me to write a story for you, then you need to know what I bring to the table in my stories, what my approaches to storytelling are, and what types of story models I am going to bring to your characters. If you don't look at my work, then how can you make me an offer? And I listened to this guy. He's like so eager to give me this offer, but when you don't look at my work, how do you know what you're going to get? Because it's the past projects I've done that show you what you're going to get in the present. And if you haven't looked at my past work, then how do you know I'm a good fit for your characters? So when I listened to that, that was another red flag for me, because when you sit there and you have never read a writer's work, you don't have an understanding of their approach to storytelling. So how can you see this guy writing your characters? Now, when I read his story, I started again to see a lot of problems with his story, because I saw again those structural issues that would make my job that much harder if I took the project, because he used a very passive approach to storytelling. And when you use a passive approach to storytelling, the reader isn't drawn in, because with comic books, you have to understand it's a character-driven model. And in a character-driven model, we need to see the main character on that splash page, and that main character has to show us what they want, the conflict that's in front of them, and most importantly, we need to be able to care about that character by the third page. But because of the pacing issues in this comic the individual had given me, there were problems, because we don't get to see this hero until the 9th page of the book. And when he comes onto the page of the 9th page of the book, he's just there to move the story forward. He has no personality, he has no voice, he has no inner conflict, and it's those inner conflicts and internal character traits that make a character relatable to the reader. Because if you're writing a story, you need to have internal character traits to show us why this person is someone we need to see as a hero. And as I was reading the story, I was like, I don't see anything in this character that shows me why this character is heroic and why people should root for this character. It's just stuff is happening on this very broad, very panoramic perspective, and everything is very passive. And you don't, again, want to use passivity in a comic. You want the action to be active, you want the hero to be front and center, and you want all of the action to revolve around the hero of the story, because it's the hero that is one of the characters that moves the story forward. And as I was reading the story, again, because of the passive approach to storytelling, stuff just happens to this character. And when you have a hero, you cannot have stuff just happening to the hero. When you have a hero in a story, they have to go on a hero's quest, and they have to work towards things. They have to earn things, because it's in that process of earning things that we learn more about this character, learn more about their motivations for doing things, and learn more about them as a person that makes us connect to them and makes us care about them. Now, as someone who has written heroes and heroines for over 25 years. I understand that when you make a hero, they have to be someone we can relate to. And this is something that I didn't see in this comic, and it really disrupted the flow of the story. Now, the other thing that really disrupted the flow of the story was that this writer really didn't make the story very organic in terms of development. They start out with a sci-fi premise, and then by the 20th or 30th page after the character's origin, we're going into the story where they're taking on this historical villain who is a demon, and its story just did not really gel organically. You cannot introduce one element of storytelling and then introduce another, because that's going to really jar the reader. And when I would use these elements, I understood that there had to be some organic cohesion to things. For example, when I wrote the book Isis, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, I had the Isis character who was the daughter of Osiris, the Egyptian god. And when she was fighting the cyber goddess, she wasn't going out here using a mythical way to defeat this technological and science fiction type villain. She had to adapt by using a scientific approach to defeating this villain. And that's what you have to do. You have to make things organic so that the character's ability to overcome the conflict comes from the concept and premise you established on page 1. And I didn't see that in the first issue they had offered me. So there were serious problems, again, as related to the structure of this story that I couldn't work with. I mean, as a writer, you have to have certain things as related to concept and premise ironed out, and you also have to be flexible about things. And that was another issue I had with this individual, is that they just weren't very flexible. Now, again, when I go out here and I'm working with different creative people, like I have on these book covers, I had to be very flexible. And the reason why I had to be very flexible as a publisher and a writer was because I understood that they were making a contribution to this project, and they had a right to have some input on this project. Yes, I am paying them to design this book cover, but again, they also have to have something in this book cover that represents their work, because this is a piece going in their portfolio, and this is a piece that is going to get them more work, because they need to have some parts that show their contribution to the project. So whenever I'm doing a project, I always am flexible on certain elements in the cover, certain elements in the concept. I'm not super rigid about things. I understand that minor cosmetic changes here and there are a part of working with an artist or working with a writer, that they are going to want to put their fingerprints on a character, and those little minor things, they don't really faze me that much, because again, I am bringing this individual in to my project, and I have to be able to defer to them based on their expertise. I remember when I was working with Mike Williams on the cover for John Haynes' A Conversation with Death, and he came up with some great ideas that I didn't really think were that great when I first saw them or heard of them, but when I first started to take a look at them from a critical perspective, I started to see where he was right about things. And when people started giving me feedback on the cover for A Conversation with Death, they told me this was one of the best covers they ever had. And they told me that this was how they envisioned John Haynes looking. So I deferred to Mike's expertise, and because of his expertise, that cover was a major success. So you have to give your artist input, and you have to listen to your artist's input, because if you don't listen to the person working with you, they may know things that you don't know, and you being rigid prevents you from making the project the best it can be. And that's one of the things I really am strong on is listening to my artists when I work with them, listening to writers if I bring them in on other projects, because they may have some understanding about things that I don't have, and they may give me some approaches that may put a fresh perspective on things. But this guy, he really wanted his comic his way, and it's hard for a writer to really work with that, because in this process you're supposed to be bringing some creativity to things, and it's hard to bring creativity to things when you have next to no input. So when I looked at that part, it was a serious problem, and we wouldn't be able to really gel as well as I have with Bill Walko or Drew Swift or Mike Williams, where we had a really strong working relationship, and usually we could just come together and put together a really great cover and have a product that could come together and sell to the reader. So with this guy, he was like really resisting me at every turn. And yes, you're going to get some disagreement and some resistance, but when you have someone who just doesn't want to listen to anything you're saying, you really cannot really work with that individual, because they don't really see how their rigidness is preventing you from being able to add something to a story. And a writer has to really be able to come in and add something to a story. Now, I have over, again, 15 years of experience in novels, screenplays, and nonfiction, and I understand things as related to character transformation arcs, things as related to story arcs, such as the overreaching arc of a comic book, the story arc of a comic book, which is the 2-issue, 3-issue, and 1-issue arc. And when I read this first issue, it just wasn't strong. In a first issue, it lays the foundation for the overall comic. So when I read that comic, it didn't leave that strong first impression on me, and it didn't really tell a strong story. So I have to come in on the story with this foundation that's really rickety and the structure that's really rickety, and it's just hard to wrap a form around this, because when you have no character development, where you have this character who has nothing that motivates them, no real interests, no hobbies, nothing really there, supporting cast that's just flat and one-dimensional, and no real relationships between anyone, it's really hard for a writer to really build on that platform. Because when in a comic book run, as I've talked about in numerous videos, a comic book writer has to come in and they have to pick up the baton from the next writer. So if you write a really bad story, that writer has to work twice as hard to clean up whatever issues you have and get some structure into the story, and then they have to wrap new form around it. And that's a lot more work than the writer has expected to come in. Usually a writer, they want to come in and they want to just start picking up where they left off. For example, like with Bill Messner-Loebs left The Flash, he left The Flash in such good shape that Mark Waid was able to come right in and build on that spectacular run. Same thing with Len Wein on After Giant Size X-Men. He built such a strong foundation that Chris Claremont was able to take the momentum and continue running with it. But when you have a rickety foundation, what the next writer has to do is they have to go in here and sometimes even have to literally demolish everything to rebuild it back up. And then after they rebuild all the structures of the story, they have to come in and wrap the form around it. And that's a lot more work than many creators are used to, because if your concept has problems with it, you just can't expect any old writer to come in here and fix it, because when it comes down to a writer, you know, they're being paid as a work for hire, and you're having them do the work of a creator. So that was way more work than I could possibly do, And with this writer's emotional attachment to these characters, I really wouldn't see a way for me to come in here and really get things structured in a way that the story would be appealing to the reader, because he was more about the book being for him than it being for the reader, and that was a major problem as related to this project, because whenever you're doing a project, you have to think about how it is seen by the reader. That was something I learned back in 2000 when I was working at AmeriCorps Vista, and I was learning about grant writing and proposal writing, is that you have to think about how somebody else is reading it, not how you read it, because you may enjoy your characters, but somebody else may not understand what you're presenting to them in your story. And this is something that when I was reading this comic, it was like a vanity project, but it wasn't coming together as a commercial project. Because in a commercial project, you have to literally explain everything for the reader so that when they come in, they can just follow it easily. Because if your concept is not laid out properly, what's going to happen is people are going to start asking questions, they're going to start seeing plot holes, they're going to start seeing things that's wrong with the characters, and they're going to start saying that there's a problem with this book, and it's going to lead to a really bad first impression on the reader. So he wasn't thinking about it from a commercial perspective, and he reminded me a lot of myself when I was 25, 26 years old, and I had first started creating the Isis character, because back then I was just really emotional and enthusiastic about the character, and I was excited about the stories I was producing, but I wasn't really in a place where I understood what the story meant to other readers. It wasn't until I started really doing work on books like Cassandra Cookbook, Temptation of John Haynes, All About Marilyn, that I really started thinking about how stories relate to the reader, and that I started really toning down my emotions and really started focusing on my craft. And when I started focusing more on my craft, that's when people started to notice my stories, and that's when they started to see the high quality that I wanted to produce in my books, because I stopped thinking about how my stories related to me. I started thinking about how they related to the reader and what the reader was going to get out of the story. But this guy, again, he was in that stage where a lot of writers are, where they're just emotional about their characters. They have this emotional attachment to them. But one of the things a writer has to do is let go of their characters, because when you let go of the character, you are letting the reader decide how they're going to interpret this character, how they're going to respond to this character, and they're going to decide whether or not they like this character. And once you let go of that character, what that does is it frees you to go out here and pursue other projects. Because I remember being in my early 20s, and I was holding on to these John Haynes and Isis characters so tightly that it wasn't allowing me to grow as a writer. And the minute I started to let these characters go, and the minute I started publishing them, I started to become a lot freer, and that allowed me to get a lot more creative. And that's something that every creator has to do, because once you let characters go and you let them enter the marketplace and let the audience decide how they're going to feel about those characters, then that takes a lot of weight off your shoulders, and then you can start exploring different concepts, different ideas, different approaches to storytelling, and different approaches to even tinkering with different story models or story paradigms, and it allows you to really grow as a writer. So this guy, I saw it as like he was still stuck in that state of arrested development creatively, because he still had an emotional attachment to those characters. And again, that was going to make it very hard to work with this guy. He wanted me to be enthusiastic about his characters, but when I approach stories these days, as someone who has over 20 years of experience, I'm not going to come into a story with emotion. I'm going to come at a story looking to make sure that there's a logical sequence to the storytelling, a cohesive way that the story is being told, making sure that every scene transitions into another scene, and making sure that the plot works well, and that the plot is something that the reader can care about. I wanted to, if I come into a project, I want to make sure that the craftsmanship is there, in addition to making sure that the story is compelling. So when you hire a professional writer, they are not really, again, approaching things from an emotional perspective. They have to look at things objectively, because if they don't look at things objectively, they can't produce a quality story for you. And I looked at this offer and I had to refuse it, because again, this creator he was not really, his project wasn't ready for publication. It really needed some serious restructuring, and it really needed a lot of work. And it was more work than I could possibly do, because when you have someone who is still emotionally attached to the characters, they are going to try to fight you at every point and not see how you can make efforts to improve that character. They're not going to be able to take the constructive criticism. Everything is all about them. And I saw that when I was really on the fence about the project, because he was sitting there telling me about Jim Shooter and Julia Schwartz and how this was an opportunity for me. But the whole thing is, he didn't see that when you offer an opportunity to someone, you have to be able to give them something that they can go out here and do something with. I mean, yes, this would be a so-called foot in the door, but if I get in the door and I produce something of poor quality, people are going to send me right out the door, because they're going to see a poor quality product, and that poor quality product is going to reflect negatively on me, because it's going to leave a bad first impression on the audience, because this was something he wasn't thinking about, because he was so in his emotions. He couldn't see that when you create a product, you have to make it the best it can be, and sometimes that means you're going to have to go through some pain. And I went through a lot of pain when I was writing books like The Changing Soul, which was the first John Haynes story. It was just absolutely terrible when I look at it now. And I thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. But I look at it now, it was a terrible story. And even now, I look at some of my other stories and I say, I can do better than this, and I want to do better than this, because I want to give the audience the very best in terms of storytelling, and I want to give them the very best in terms of quality. So I want to go out here and I want to do a great job as a writer, and I want an opportunity to show what I can bring to the table as a writer. And when you have creators who don't really understand what the writer's job is, they take it for granted. They, like this guy, he just thought anybody could write anything. However, they don't understand that when a writer comes into a project, they have to do research, and they have to understand what they're writing about. Because, for example, when I went out here to start writing the Matilda Crowley character, and I wanted to create this African-American goth character, I had to not just go on what I thought I knew about the goth subculture, because what I thought I knew really was not what the goth subculture was all about. It was a semblance based on snippets of things I saw on Jenny Jones and things that I saw at Comic-Cons and things I saw in the street. But it wasn't until I sat down and watched the YouTube videos of actual goths that I began to understand the goth subculture and the foundations of it, with it being one of the foundations being the music, the core foundation, and listening to the music of the goth subculture. That's when I started to really understand it, and that's when I really started to really go in depth writing these stories like Spellbound, which detailed Matilda Crowley's baby bat years and her entrance into the goth subculture, and Legendary Mad Matilda, which really took you into Matilda's growing pains as a goth in what I call the adolescent stage. So when I really started digging deep into it, I really was able to put a richer picture on it, and I was able to give the reader an experience of being black and being goth and the struggles of a biracial person in America during the late 80s and early 90s. So I was able to do that because I had not only watched the videos, I read websites, and I listened to a lot of people who talked to me and told me about their experience. So I was able to come and approach that story because I went out here and did the research, I listened to the people, and I did that because I respected the people of the subculture, and I wanted to present their story in a way that was balanced, a way that presented the people of the subculture in a positive light, and presented them in a humanized light. Because as I saw it, a lot of goths have to deal with a lot of stereotypes and a lot of people creating products that really don't represent the subculture positively or push stereotypes. But what I wanted to do was try to make balanced stories that not only showed you the goth subculture, but showed you black people in the goth subculture in a humanized way. So when I approach a story, I want to really take you in depth in that story. I want to give you something that you're going to learn out of that story, like I did with the Thetas, where I had this Colleen character who was a feminist and she thought sororities were garbage. But then as she's entering into this, pledging this sorority, she's learning more about their culture, their ideas, their mission. And after I published that story, in 2013, I believe, many people said that it was like one of the most original takes on a sorority. And some women were saying they were surprised that a man could write a story that well. But that, again, came from my research that I did on the subject, and that came from my skill as a writer and my skill in my craft to create a character transformation arc. And this is what I wanted to do in comics, but from what I heard from this individual, nobody really has that dedication to craft in comics. It's more about who you know, and who you know will assign you to whatever book they want to assign you. And I listened to that part of his argument, and I said, this is one of the reasons why the comic book industry is in dire straits. For example, he talked about how Brian Michael Bendis was assigned Superman based on his popularity, but when you take a look at Brian Michael Bendis' writing, it's not very good. If I look at his track record from Jessica Jones onward, he's really not good at creating characters, he's not really good at developing characters, and when I look at his recent Iron Man run, he was just completely out of his depth. And because he did not know how to write high-tech Iron Man adventures, he then brings in Riri Williams, the Mary Sue, to cover up his inability to show that he did the research on the character's history, or the approaches to storytelling, and that all showed in how terrible his Iron Man comics are, and they're showing right now in how bad his Superman comic books are. Because when you look at his Superman comics, they take the character out of who he is, his mission, and yes, the editors assigned him this book, but again, had they looked at his past work and had they looked at his declining sales, they would do what I would have done and said, look, he's just not a good fit for this character. His track record on these books is marginal at best, and he's really out of his depth with characters who have superpowers. He's maybe good on a Spider-Man or a Daredevil, but when it comes down to more complex characters, he has problems. And this is something that the guy didn't understand about the old techniques of hiring writers, because again, when you hire a writer, you really want to make sure you hire the right person, because this person is going to be the person laying the foundation for your form and constructing the form for your stories, constructing the form that creates your concept, creating the plots that tell the stories about your character, and creating the pictures for your comic book. So if you hire the wrong person and their vision just does not fit this character, what they're going to do is produce a book that is extremely poor quality, and it's not going to leave a strong first impression on the reader. So whenever you have a person who is pushing you, it's not a good sign, because it's a sign that they're just trying to push you into their project, and you don't really want to push creative people into your project. Whenever I approach an artist for a cover, usually I just introduce myself, and then I ask them what their rates are, and if they come in and tell me their rates, I then show them the concept, and then we go from there. Usually there is no pushing, there is no prodding. I mean, I may send them an email maybe 2 or 3 weeks in to ask where they are on the project, but usually I give my creative people space when I work with them, because I understand that they have other projects they're working on, they have other commissions they're working on, and usually they need breathing room to be creative, and that's part of trust. And that was one of the things that I had an issue with this guy, was he wasn't giving me the space I needed to write. Because usually when a writer writes, they usually just, you give them your proposal, they go out here, they write the project, and that's the way it works in trade publishing. But I don't know how it works in comics, but when I looked at this concept, it was clear to me this guy really did not understand the post-1990 comic book world, because when Image Comics entered the comic book world, the days of editors assigning people projects went out the window, and the days of really dictating to creators what they should take, that went out the window as well, because at Image, we had Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and Rob Liefeld literally going out here and making their own stuff. And then we had other independent companies like Top Cow and all these other ones, Chaos Comics. People were making their own stuff, and they were making it to their terms. So when you were dealing with a writer in the 1990s onward market, it's not one where the publisher is dictating to the creator. The creator is coming in saying that they want to offer something as well. So that's one of the things that I see as a problem with the modern comic book industry, is that people don't understand that the creator is not coming to people now from a begging perspective. They are approaching you from a professional perspective, and when they come to you, they are looking to show you what they have to offer. They are looking to propose what they want to contribute, and they're looking to propose how to make this business deal work for both parties. Like, for example, when I wrote a blog about the Wonder Woman run I proposed, or other characters, I proposed what I wanted to tell in my story, how this would affect the character, and how this would allow the publisher to be able to expand its audience for the character. So I approach it from a very business perspective, because when you're writing a story at a trade publisher, it has to be something that's commercial, it has to be something that can sell, and if you don't bring that to the table and show how it's going to sell, you're really wasting people's time. And one of the other things he did was just kept telling me about the money he had to offer, which was like, I think it was a couple $100, and again, showed me that it was more about trying to get me on his project that quickly, but not thinking about the quality of the project. Because when it comes down to a writer, yes, writers have page rates, I've found, and usually a couple $100 isn't going to pay a writer's page rates for the work that they have to do. In addition to plotting and restructuring, I mean, you have to have a lot of money to pay a writer to do that type of work. They're not going to come in and work on your project for free or a couple of $100 when they have to spend days in front of a keyboard trying to iron out a story, or going out here and making efforts to restructure a story. I remember when I was working on the ISIS All That Glitter script, I mean, I've gone through about 2 or 3 drafts right now, and I had to iron out different things as related to what these panels are going to be, what's going to be in these panels, what shots are going to be used in these panels, and how these panels are going to sequence into transitioning from one scene to the next so that the reader's eyes can move forward. So it's a lot of work putting one of these scripts together, and you're not going to get that kind of work for a couple $100, even if you're dealing with a rookie writer, as he said. But when I look at my experience, I've published over 60 books in novels, in nonfiction, and screenplays. So I look at what I have to offer to the table, and I look at the value of what I'm offering, and that is over 20 years of experience in storytelling, over 20 years of understanding how the craft of the story works in the novel, how the story works in the screenplay, and how the story possibly works. It could work in a comic book, and I didn't want to lower my value just going and running for the first offer given to me, because yes, I love comic books. I've loved comic books ever since I was 9 years old, and it's always been my passion to write comic books. But when I go to write comics, I want them to be on the same level of quality as my novels, because many of my readers read my novels and enjoy them, and I want them to have that same level of enjoyment when they read my comics. So when I looked at this offer, it was one I had to refuse, because I believed I could not contribute to this project in a way that would make it the best quality possible. Now, when I'm working on this ISIS Indiegogo, I'm looking at it and I want to make sure that it meets a high quality of standards. And again, I understand that in meeting those standards, I have to respect the people I'm working with, whether it be Bill Walker, the artist, or the colorist, or the letterer I hire. And we have to have a level of professionalism, because those people need to be treated with respect, and they need to be given space to do their work, and they need to be trusted to do their work. And that's something I want to bring to the table, because I understand that in order for me to make a great comic, I need to treat my people well who are working with me, because we are a team. And as a team, I understand that yes, I am offering them an opportunity to work on my project, but when I offer them that opportunity to work on my project, they aren't somebody who needs to be so made to believe that they have to be grateful to me, because I understand that in today's marketplace, just like you make an offer to a person, they can say no to you, they can pass on you, and not every opportunity given to you is one that can benefit you long term. So when somebody comes to me and says, I'm offering you a foot in the door, it's not language that's really going to persuade me to, come and join them, because a foot in the door can lead to a foot out of the door if the product isn't that great. So as a creator, I'm looking at the big picture as related to these projects, my place in them, and how they will impact my overall work portfolio. And I want to make sure that I give people the best quality work. So a lot of people, they want to make a writer like myself an offer, but you have to make an offer of something that will be valuable to me in the future. So when I'm working on your project, when I go out here and I make a publication, I have something that I can give to someone else to say, this is the work that I worked on, and this is how much quality it is. Because it doesn't matter if it's a Marvel product, a DC product, an IDW product, or an indie product. Whenever you have a product in your portfolio, a project in your portfolio, it should be something that when you hand it to somebody else, they can look at it and say, this is top quality, and this is a reason why I should hire you, because if you're going to do this level of work for this company, then you're going to bring that same standard of quality to my company. And with my SJS Direct imprint, I want to show people that if I could go out here and try to bring this high level of quality to my own work, then I'm going to bring that level of quality to your work. So when I listened to this offer, it was one I had to refuse, because this guy wasn't there, and he wasn't ready for prime time. When I looked at his book,
it needed more work than I could possibly do for him. And the best thing for me to do was pass on this project, because when I looked at the overall story structures and I looked at the concept, it was just something that needed more work than he had money to pay for. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.